just how little of South Sudan's international borders with other African countries have been demarcated. The British and the Belgians, before either one of them had stepped into the area, decided that the Nile-Congo watershed would be the border between whatever countries the two imperial powers were going to try to take. And the Nile-Congo watershed has never been surveyed, it's never been demarcated. I mentioned this to Pagana Moon a few years ago, and he said, "Oh, that's not a problem. We know where it is. We used to drive along it during the war." Now, that's one issue, but I think a more important issue is something that we had to deal with in the ABA Boundaries Commission, which is precisely what Levin was mentioning at the end of this film. You need a border that people can cross. Now, how you define what is a territory belonging to one group of people or another has been something that has been discussed and developed in the discussion of land rights in Africa. In fact, one of the textbooks on land rights in Africa was written by a man named Simpson, who is a former Sudan political service officer. So the experience of Sudanese has been something that has been brought into the discussion of how you determine people's rights to the use of land as opposed to the rights to the ownership of land. And Professor Shadrach Gutto from South Africa, who was a member of the ABA Boundaries Commission, introduced this as a part of the discussion. You have what are known as primary rights, where people are settled, where they have their homesteads, where they have their fields. And then you have secondary rights, where they where people have seasonal use of territory. Now, if you have a country where there are a lot of people who are pastoralists or livestock keepers, and you have seasonal movements of transhumance, you're going to have places where you have different people, where different plots of land have overlapping rights between people who live there at certain points of the year and people who come and use it. I think there is a conspiracy going on. Okay. I don't know if this is any better.
It's on.
Is it on?
Yes.
Okay, great. Right. So, for instance, when we were trying to deal with the ABA Boundaries Commission, there was an area where the Nok Dinka had their homesteads, had their villages, had their cultivated land. And sometimes Misurio, during the dry season, would move their cattle into those areas. And this was something that had been going on for decades, generations, where there was an understanding that people had a seasonal use of land when, for instance, the Nok Dinka had moved their cattle to another part of the country. And this is something that has happened all across Sudan. It's not just the area where you now have the north-south border. It is something, for instance, Gaim Kibriab has written about this for a number of places of Sudan, where under the condominium and during the independence period, governments, civil administrations regulated this movement of people, seasonal movement of people in and out of areas. They had a watch. I don't have one, okay? So you have the problem that has arisen, and not just between Sudan and South Sudan, is now you have people claiming, and governments claiming, that because certain people or group have the seasonal use of land, that seasonal use, that secondary use, is now being claimed as ownership. Not only is this happening with the government of Sudan claiming ownership of land that South Sudan Sudanese people claim their own, but South Sudan is also making that claim that some parts of the borderland where South Sudanese have moved in seasonally, that the South Sudanese government has claimed this. And it's not just between the governments. You have, for instance, now the dispute on the southern boundary of Abyei, the dispute between the Twitch-Mayardit and the Nokdinka, where, again, the seasonal use is being used as an argument that a group of people owns the land because they have been there at some point during the year. And that is something that has been, I think, bedeviling any sort of resolution, not just of the international border between Sudan and South Sudan. It is an issue that is certainly is affecting and will continue to affect the individual communities within South Sudan until such time as the government and the civil administration establishes some sort of understanding of what people have as dominant rights where they live and secondary rights where they come on a seasonal basis.
Okay. That's it.
Are there any questions, comments on these important issues?
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Johnson. My question is about Panther, which is a glitch. I feel like evidences that are very clear are always ignored by the demarcation body in terms of glitch. Because we know that in 1976, Chevron did their oil research in South Sudan in Hitlich, and that part was part of South Sudan. How it was then transferred, it was clearly, as has been explained, Nimeri changed the boundaries by creating Nile's unity state. Why can people acknowledge that the discovery of oil in Hitlich, which was accepted as in South Sudan, being disputed by the North?
I'm not sure that's a boundary question I can answer. That is a matter of the politics of oil. And once oil, unfortunately, is found in a border region, then this is ripe for conflict of different claims. I will just make one point about the so-called 1956 border. The date of when it was decided that Sudan would become independent on the 1st of January 1956, that was decided on the 27th of December 1955. Not a lot of time to prepare. It didn't really matter from the point of view of internal boundaries because this was not being changed by the fact that Sudan was becoming independent. But as one of the problems, of course, Levin has mentioned this is something that has bedeviled all sorts of the Boundary Commission, is that there is this insistence within South Sudan especially that the British know where their boundary is, and that the British have a map that is dated the 1st of January 1956 that has all this information. Now, I will just point out that the maps of Sudan were created by the Sudan Survey Department, not by the Ordnance Survey Department in Britain. If you look at the 1 to 250,000 maps, the ones that have the most detail on them, you will see that the dotted line of province boundaries often go through blank spaces. There's not a lot to anchor them on. when you come to the issue of Panthal, which is now disputed, not only disputed between Sudan and South Sudan, but is disputed between the Awet Dinka and the Nok Dinka. The dispute there is partly because the area around Panthal is an area that has been used as seasonal grazing by a number of different people. Not only the Dinka of Unity State, not only the Nok Dinka, but even to a certain extent some of the Miseria. So that is an area that doesn't necessarily have a lot of permanent settlement around it to anchor a claim, but has a lot of seasonal use. That the claims around it are being anchored on seasonal use of these are our pastures. Nobody disputes. This is our pasture. This is where our grazing ground is. And that is where part of what, I mean, obviously very few people in Khartoum, and I would suggest very few people in Juba, are concerned about the grass around Panthal. It is the oil underneath the grass that they're worried about. But the claims of ownership are based on the seasonal use of that area.
It's very short. Rida Jibril from Green Cordova charity. We work with children who've been displaced by war. And I have very much interest in peace. So I just wanted to kind of ask, as there is a lot of kind of people who've been involved in negotiating teams to kind of bring people together around sorting the border issues. Why people are not able to kind of go back to the old traditional kind of culture in Sudan about kind of boundaries and not border. It's like, do not harm people and do not harm the land. Why that cannot be used as a method to kind of basically work to bring people together to kind of find a way of solution? Is that possible?
I'm not sure that I'm the man to answer that question. I think one of the problems, of course, is that we're now talking about national ownership. It's not just a matter of individual communities. When you create a nation state, the nation state has its claims to its own sovereignty. And that's what I think, that is where you have a hardening of the borders and a hardening of the question that has to be answered and managed. Back in 2006, I suggested to Salva Kiir that instead of focusing on the issue of drawing the line and deciding the border, that it would be more in the interest of both nations to set up some sort of borderlands management, so that movements between people could be done on a regular basis, as they had been done in the past, before Sudan became independent and even after Sudan became independent. To focus on making sure that people are able to use the resources above the ground in the way that they had before, without creating conflict. He said that was a good idea.
Thank you, Douglas. That will have to be our last question. If I could thank Florence and both discussants, Douglas, we don't have any more time.
Really wants to ask a question.
I'm sorry, we have run out of time. So thank you, Florence, and Douglas and Nabil, and thank you, everybody.